Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first theorem of 2025. Woohoo! When you think about the best teams, you gravitate to teams with the highest overall damage per action value. In the world of constant power creep, this is almost a ritualistic activity. Naturally, you also include those units in those teams to be the best in their own right through different ways. But that isn't always the case. The unfortunate reality of a gacha game is that you can't always expect to have the best options. Anyone doing so is sitting on an ivory tower of credit cards. You inevitably have limited options if you do not spend and must work with what you have. Having every character is about as powerful or debatably unrealistic as any E6 in your account, since you have so much diversity to tackle endgame content. So what exactly is the Acheron Theorem? Almost every unit in the game has their value tied to a quote-unquote hidden stat that most people don't talk about and what calcs can't show. For example, if two teams built around two main DPS have high overlap with each other, at some point, even if those two teams are the best in the game, they'll start fighting over each other's team members, and usually you end up at a deficit since one team is missing a high demand unit that can have a distinct impact on your total performance. If the team has no overlaps, they perform much better even if they aren't the most meta units in the game. In an individual's account, the choices made to strengthen a roster is the core aspect of Starrail's gameplay loop, and having the highest damage alone is not the be-all end-all as exampled through the game's history. This is the Acheron Theorem, and if you're still confused, that's fine, because today we will be showing examples of overlaps being almost everything to a team or even an individual unit's perceived and effective power level. If a team consists of so many niche teammates that it only works in that team for lower results, how valuable can they be? During 1.2 with the release of Kafka, Hyper Carry was the top meta team. There was no debate about that. Every other team was missing a lot of pieces and were runner-ups in every scenario. Bronya and Tingyun was a whole different level of raw numbers for Hyper Carry. Compare that with Asta on DOT. Follow-up attack buffs didn't even have a specified buffer, and Silverwolf with break setups was a little clunky. This was largely the reason why Kafka didn't seem to be so successful in holding rates and sales than expected. DOT was still second at the very least, but it was not the top team. But those that did have DOT built had a very unique advantage. Because DOT is so strict on being synergistic with each other, the other team is not fighting for Kafka and Sampo, and vice versa, DOT is not trying to steal away Bronya or Tingyun. This means on one side you have a team that is completely self-contained that can do a good run but not outright broken, and one side, for example being Azila Clear, is sure to be crazy and overperforming since she has free reign to use Bronya and Tingyun, her best in slot units. Compare that to say an account only having Jingyuan and Zila instead of Kafka in either place. Then later on, if your roster had both Blade and Jingliu, both top meta characters that beat DOT with their best in slot, they would desperately want to clone Bronya to avoid one side being scuffed and missing out on their best in slot damage. If you replace Blade with a weaker Kafka, you wouldn't have any more issues of a scuffed Jingliu and end up with a similar or even better result. DOT havers pretty much just chilled with having one side covered without worrying about what their other side is thinking for team slots. A very good secret utility for your roster. DOT teams are what can be considered the first orthogonal team and an example of why overlaps can affect balancing. DOT is so weird and self-contained that they lead to better performance for your roster by taking the most niche characters to a point of being viable but not broken, thereby giving more freedom for your team that actually uses high demand units like hyper carry teams to shine and lead to a better clear. Of course, with time DOT did start to fall apart by the lack of updates, but still, they have to receive the credit for being the first team to do it. If lower overlaps for teams were good, then what about an individual? During 1.6, we saw Ruan, who was a meta support for the DOT archetype and other dual carry archetypes. Her weakness break-based buffs started to bleed into MOC around 2.0 to 2.1. The trend of enemies and stage buffs leaning more into multi-DPS archetypes meant one thing was clear. Ruan had overlap in both sides of endgame and was in severely high demand. Naturally, that meant Ruan was an extremely valuable character, and whatever successor she had was also equally prized. Ruan could not be in two places at once, and she was so good in either side and so many teams that you can convince a good amount of people in 2.2 to pull for another unit that's a copy of Ruan. Even if the new Ruan weren't strictly better and even just a one-to-one copy, theory, she would be just as good because you can now run Ruan Mei on two sides now. This was why even if Robin follow-up attack wasn't actually beating the top break team and Acheron team around her release, she felt much better for many accounts and still higher value than what would be suggested, because she lets go of Ruan Mei for those teams. Teams like DOT and follow-up attack can finally coexist with a top team super break to a higher level without needing to steal away Ruan Mei. This is why overlaps are almost everything, specifically used as a solution for balancing issues. HSR's endgame, as much as it can give you this impression, is not based on the single best meta team or character, because realistically, you need two teams to clear. Units are rated highly if they're the best for multiple archetypes, but as Ruan Mei has shown, this can create a vacuum where even a slightly less performing support, Robin around that time, just because they can be a good substitute for a team, in a way stalling power creep for a little while. Honestly, if the game went into a different direction and abused this phenomenon more, power creep could have been slower. Lastly, can overlap be used as a tool to balance the future-proofing of meta characters? Acheron was released in 2.1 regarded as the top meta DPS in the game. Many people assume this is due to raw numbers, but that wasn't the full story. For one, Acheron actually did not output the highest damage team around her release. It was DOT with Ruan Mei, and while Acheron can fit with DOT, DOT performed much better without her. Using a damage simulator, you can see that Acheron at E0S1 wasn't actually that ceiling breaking around the time, and due to DOT's presence, this ended up being the best two-team combo from what I've gathered. Even in the future, you can see Super Break being a better option. Does that mean Acheron was simply overrated and people were wrong? No, not exactly. She was just broken for a very different reason. Looking at Acheron's teams around that time, you should notice two things. One, her design is so unique that she doesn't have much overlap with other teams. And two, because of that, her entry level is absurd. Like DOT earlier, Acheron's team structure was different to its advantage. Her emanator design allowed her to use nihility units who outside DOT have been missing a clear direction since Harmony's domination. This meant her team was self-contained in its own way. Like Ruan Mei and Robin, Acheron provided a Robin-like effect. Even if the best Ruan Mei or Robin team ended up being better than Acheron, just the fact that Acheron is good enough to not need either meant those harmonies were liberated from being stolen away. And finally, what made Acheron feel so busted for so many people was her usage of weaker units. Acheron's numbers out of context isn't better than the top meta team because she can't use conventionally stronger meta units like Ruan Mei. The fact that she was a second best with such weak options meant she had an exciting future and a lot of room to grow from the offset as a DPS. Many of these weaker options are 4 stars with few demand from other teams like Winaifen and Pela, leading to her popularity as a free-to-play monster, and the resulting future was units like Zhao Cho, bringing her up to top standards with more coming in the future. The only other team that had an overlap was Dr. Ratio Hypercarry, and even then you could get around that. This is why I chose her as the namesake of this theorem. Acheron and her peers of emanator designs follow a unique pattern. They have a symbiotic relationship with specific weaker units. Weaker units can turn back the clock and be finally useful by an emanator giving value to their niche, allowing more recycling of resources that you already spent if you already built them. If you remove the elements of their lack of overlaps via their specificity, it leads to a more toxic metagame since the top DPS cannot separate each other enough through their teams. Acheron shows that the use of orthogonal units, units with no overlap to other teams, can not only be viable and a benefit, but can be the identity of a meta unit and the future of a healthier metagame. That's all for the first theorem of 2025. I hope you guys like it. There's definitely more to this than what I said. This is only a substat of team overlap. There's more ways overlaps can actually be relevant and be much more simple. Like pulling for a lightning DPS is bad if you already have one. That's called a type overlap. Pulling for more than 2 limited sustains causes role overlap that isn't worth the price. That is role overlap, like I said. But I wanted to stick with 3, and I feel like this is 3 of the most interesting that I got in my mind. But yeah, how else do you guys think overlaps are a hidden stat that can affect the meta viability of a unit? Let me know in the comments below. I'll see you next week, I guess. There's a lot of videos coming up. I'm really hyped for 3.0, and I'll see you. Bye bye.